In 1962, Marvin Gaye walked into Motown's Hitsville, USA studio and recorded an album. Not the album Berry Gordy wanted, not the album Motown's system had planned. The album Marvin wanted to make, a collection of jazz standards in the style of Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra, the singers he had grown up listening to, and whose particular combination of elegance and emotional directness had shaped his understanding of what a voice could do with a song. Gordy heard it. His response was immediate and practical. The album would not be released. It did not fit what Motown was building. The label's commercial momentum was pointed in a different direction, toward soul, toward rhythm and blues, toward the specific pop crossover sound that Gordy had been developing with his house producers and which was beginning to move through American radio with extraordinary effectiveness. A jazz standards album by an unknown 23-year-old, however skillfully performed, was not part of that plan. Gordy told Marvin to wait. What he was waiting for was not entirely clear. Waiting, in the Motown system, was a form of instruction, a signal that the artist's current understanding of what they were needed to develop, to move in the direction the label required, to find the version of themselves that the machinery could use. It was not cruelty. Gordy was not, in any ordinary sense, a cruel man. He was a man who had built something extraordinary by understanding precisely what the American music market wanted, and who applied that understanding to every decision he made, including the decision about which artists were ready to be heard and in what form. Marvin was not, in Gordy's assessment, ready. The album was evidence of what he could do when he was left to his own instincts, and his instincts, while genuine, were currently pointing in the wrong direction. Marvin waited. And while he waited, he watched. The morning Marvin walked into Berry Gordy's office is not dated with precision in any document that has survived. What is known is that it happened sometime in 1964, after 2 years of waiting, and that what came out of the conversation was a shift in direction that Gordy himself would later describe as one of the most important decisions of his tenure at the label. What Marvin said, in substance, was that he had been watching for 2 years and that he understood now what the label needed. Not what he had tried to give it in 1962, not the jazz standards, not the Sinatra and Cole material that was his first instinct, but something different, something that had the soul and the gospel heat that Motown's producers were working with, but delivered with the kind of vocal complexity and emotional nuance that Marvin's voice was capable of, and that no one at the label was yet fully using. He was not asking permission. He was proposing a specific thing, with the confidence of a man who had spent 2 years arriving at a precise understanding of what he could offer and what the machine could do with it. Gordy listened. He heard something different from what he had heard in 1962, not just in what Marvin was proposing, but in how he was proposing it. The young singer who had wanted to make a jazz album had been replaced by something more complicated, a man who had internalized the system well enough to work within it, and who was bringing, to that negotiation, the specific mixture of artistic ambition and commercial awareness that Motown's model required. The first single that followed the conversation was "Stubborn Kind of Fellow," released in the summer of 1962. It reached number 8 on the R&B chart. The follow-up singles moved higher. By 1963, Marvin Gaye was a working commercial success at Motown. Not yet at the level he would eventually reach, but building, song by song, toward it. The Jazz Standards album remained on the shelf. What Marvin watched over the 2 years that followed was the Motown machine at full operation. The early 1960s were the years when Berry Gordy's vision revealed itself as something more than a business strategy. When the artists he had signed and the music he had produced began moving through the country in ways that none of them had fully anticipated. The Miracles, the Marvelettes, Mary Wells, the Temptations just beginning, the Supremes about to become. Gordy's assembly line was producing extraordinary music. Music that was climbing charts, crossing racial barriers in American radio, reaching into suburban living rooms that had never before received music from a black-owned record label as their primary pop entertainment. It was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement, and Marvin Gaye was inside it, connected to it through his marriage to Anna Gordy, watching it from close range, unable to be fully part of it because his album was on a shelf, and his direction was wrong, and Gordy had told him to wait. He was not idle. He performed. Motown used him as a session drummer on various recordings, a fact that is both humbling and instructive, since the man who would eventually make What's Going On spent his first years at the label playing drums behind other people's voices. He played the Motown Revue. He kept himself present in the machinery of the label, available and professional, doing what he was given. But what he was learning, what the 2 years of waiting built in him slowly and through the specific frustration of watching everyone around him find their groove while his own remained out of reach, was something that a successful first album would not have taught him. He was learning the system from the inside, not as an observer, but as a participant who had been shown his limits and had spent 2 years deciding what to do with them. He was learning what the machinery rewarded and what it didn't. He was learning what Berry Gordy heard when he listened to a record and what he didn't hear. He was learning the particular grammar of commercial soul music, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, through the experience of watching other Motown artists navigate it successfully while he stood to the side. The Jazz Standards album was eventually released in 1964 under the title The Soulful Moods of Marvin Gaye. By that point, Marvin had already had his first R&B hit, and the album arrived as a curiosity rather than an introduction, a glimpse into the first direction he had wanted to go before the label sent him somewhere else. It sold modestly. Critics who encountered it noted the voice. The instrument was already fully formed, already the voice that would eventually make What's Going On and Let's Get It On and Sexual Healing. What it was searching for in 1962 was a context equal to what it could do. The 2 years of waiting gave Marvin Gaye the context. Not the context he had imagined when he arrived at Motown with his jazz standards and his Frank Sinatra influences, but the context that the world he was actually living in required. The Motown sound was not what he had dreamed of making, but it was the form in which his voice could reach the people who needed to hear it, and the form in which he could begin building toward the music he actually wanted to make, slowly, carefully, over the decade that followed. Most artists never get the education that those 2 years gave Marvin Gaye. Most artists either succeed immediately, which denies them the friction necessary to understand what they actually are, or fail completely, which ends the conversation. Marvin was given something rarer. 2 years of being present without being used, of watching without performing, of learning the system from the inside while the system waited for him to become what it needed. The man who walked into Gordy's office in 1964 was not the man who had recorded the jazz standards in 1962. The 2 years had made him someone the system could use, which was, for the time being, exactly what he needed to be. The rest of the plan, the part that the system could not anticipate and would eventually be unable to contain, came later. But it came from a man who had waited 2 years, watched everything, and learned. Marvin Gaye was never, after those 2 years, a man who didn't understand the room he was in. He simply decided, eventually, that understanding the room was not the same thing as belonging to it.